This is TWiT.
Well, I think it's time to talk about the water of life, if you don't
Absolutely.
mind. Better that than testicles, anyway.
And I may have mentioned last week, as much as I was having glitchy problems in Microsoft Studios, that because it was during the MVP Summit, I had been brought a lot of bottles of whiskey, which I did not bring with me to Vegas. I took them home, but I had been meaning to talk about Highland Park for a while. So I've, prepared that conversation for this. It's another very popular whiskey without a doubt. And it's one of the island whiskeys. We talk about the different regions of Scottish whiskey, but the islands is kind of a misnomer because generally when I say island whiskeys, you mean Islay or Jura, maybe Skye, which is in a very different location, but this is the Orkneys, and the Orkneys are north
the
of
old,
Scotland.
good old Orkneys. Yes.
So the Shetland Islands, of course, are even farther, and the Faroe Islands even farther than that. But the Orkneys are the ones relatively up close. They're actually a group of about 70 islands, of which only 3 are really big. The largest one's called Mainland, which is hilarious. Maybe 20,000 people live total on the islands. 3/4 of them live on mainland, which is about 500 square kilometers. And there's only 3 towns across the whole set of islands that have more than 500 people in them. So it is very distributed there. The big town is Kirkwall. There's an overnight ferry from Aberdeen you can take, although there are other ferries, mostly just passenger ferries, that come from great places like Scrabster and Gills and John O'Groats. Which is all on Caithness, which is the northern part of the mainland of Scotland. Why are people there? Well, very fertile soils. Also, an incredibly mild climate. The temperatures in the wintertime are about 4 degrees centigrade, maybe 39 Fahrenheit. And the highs in the summertime average about 12 degrees, only like 55. So it's never that cold and it's never that hot. Yeah, they dip below freezing sometimes, but the Gulf Stream keeps it pretty steady there. But the wind is constant. There are virtually no trees of any kind. But there's been people there for a really long time. They make more than their total power consumption electricity, even though they're connected to the mainland. They actually dumping electricity into Scotland for the most part. And they're far enough north that at the summer solstice, it doesn't get dark at night. They call it the simmerdim when it gets that bright. So it's an island. The islands are about farming, mostly sheep and cattle. There's still some grain growing there. Of course, there's lots of fishing, and then tourism is huge. Obviously, took a blow during the pandemic, but it's already back into swing. And that's Highland Park is located up there. It's not the only distillery up there. There's also Scapa, and a couple of years ago, the Dearness Distillery opened as well. Their big tourism attraction is Neolithic structures. So there's evidence that humans have been living on the Orkneys from as soon as the ice retreated back from there. So there's been artifacts found that are from 9,000 BC, and there are standing buildings from 5,000 BC. So this is Mesolithic, not even Neolithic, like the Middle Stone Age. And then, of course, the Neolithic peoples, which were part of the Daggerlands and all of that area when the water was much lower because the ice was still retreating. And they were the megaliths, the folks who built standing stone structures. And there's a ton of them on the Orkneys for as small as they are. The must-see is like the Ring of Brogdar, which is 90 or 60 standing stones in a ring. There's also the Stones of Stennis, which includes the Odin Stone, just in case you weren't sure the Norse connects, and Meishau. And of course, I mentioned the Neolithic village that's in Skara Brae. And there are literally still standing. They were buried, under sands and things, 5,000-year-old Neolithic homes. Absolutely worth the look. The Romans knew about the Orkney Islands. They called them the Arcades, or the Latin, which was actually derived from the earlier Celtic names before the Norwegians showed up. The name itself is kind of funny. The word orc, there's actually a Celtic word orc, which means pig. So there's a theory that the old name was the Island of the Young Pigs. But then when the Picts take control of it, for the most part after that, although occasionally the Gauls come through, and then ultimately the Norse are in control by about 900 AD. And the Orkneys were really the base of operations for the Nordic attacks throughout the UK islands for several hundred years. And of course, the Norse word orc means seal. So suddenly it was the island of seals, which the Orkneys have plenty of. And then finally, as the Norse movements fade off, by the 1472, it's declared part of Scotland, like most of the rest of Scotland, and it's the Kingdom of Scotland thereafter. So Highland Park, as I mentioned, was near Kirkwall. It's just off the A961 if you want to drive there. It's in the southern part of the town. Highland Park is not named for the Highlands of Scotland, which is on the mainland. It's actually named for High Park, which is where it's located. So the grounds of Orkney are pretty low everywhere. There's a few sandstone hills and things, but this one raised area south of Kirkland is called High Park, and that's why it's called Highland Park. The actual origins of the place are kind of fun because it goes far enough back into the 1700s that the historical records are not great. My personal favorite version of it, many other people's like it, is a character named Magnus Unsson, which again, very Norwegian name, who was both a priest and possibly a butcher by day, but was also an illegal distiller and smuggler by night. And the record of him existing comes from a criminal charge in 1798 of illegal distilling up in High Park. We really don't hear about him much again, but that same location gets an official license as a distillery in 1826 by one Robert Borwick. Don't know if he was related or not. It's all again a bit fuzzy. It was one of the very first legal distillery license issued, certainly in the Orkneys, but in most of Scotland. 1826 was pretty early on, and for about 70 years, it stays in the Borwick family through a couple of generations until it's eventually sold in 1895 to James Grant, and that's Glenlivet. So back in the space side, and they continue to operate it. Things get shuffled around for a few years. Towards the end of Prohibition in 1937, it's acquired by Highland Distillers. So Highland Distillers have been operating since the late 1880s, 1887 or so. And they operated the Bunhabban and the Glenrothes distillery, which we talked about a few weeks ago. And the Highland Distillers also acquired Glenglassaugh, Tamdhu, Famous Grouse, Parkmore, Glenturret, and the Macallan. And then in 1999, were quote unquote bought by the Edrington Group, which is not really what happened. What happened is after so many generations of the family that owned Highland Distillers moving on, they decided to create a trust to protect these distilleries. In the 90s was when Diageo was emerging and trying to take everything. And so they built this legal structure to keep the group together and then transferred ownership into the Edrington Group. So still the same families, just a new entity and a different structure to keep the distilleries together. Highland Park is best known for getting the first perfect 100-point score in the Ultimate Whiskies Challenge in 2013 for their Highland Park 25. I have never tasted it. You probably never will. Then the 2013 edition of a Highland Park, if you can find one, last sold at auction for about $1,200 US. Now, if you're going to make whiskey in a windy farming area north of Scotland, you are not going to use wood and you're not going to use coal. You're going to use peat because that's what you got. But not all peat is made equal. So most of the peat that we think about is from Islay, which is down in the southwest, which has a very strong sort of seaweed component to it. It tends to be more tarry and resinous. Even the mainland peats that have more lignin in them because they're just decayed plants, so they have more trees in them, have stronger flavors. There are no trees on the Orkneys, and so their peat is primarily sphagnum moss and heather. That's what grows there. That's what decays there. That's what becomes peat bog there. And so it actually has a different scent and a different flavor. Now, that being said, only 20% of the barley that's used in a Highland Park is actually the peated malt from the island. And in fact, Highland still does their own maltings, unlike almost any other distillery, although the majority of the barley in a Highland Park comes from the commercial processors. Highland Park talks about 5 keystones in the way they make their whiskey, that they do hand-turned floor maltings, like I just described with their peated barley, that they use what they call Hobster Moor peat, which is from the Hobster Moor, which is this heather peat, and that they use sherry casks, cool maturation, and cask harmonization. Those are the 5 keystones. So 20% of the barley is this still hand-turned peated barley that they do themselves, because none of the rest of them do this anymore, and then they use commercial pre-prepared grist for the rest. That means their ppm level's lower than most, Your typical Lagavulin running about 50, 60 ppm. This is more like 12. So it's an intro to peat. Like, it's really quite gentle, and it's a sweeter peat anyway. So they do their big batch in the mash tun. They do their worts into Oregon pine washbacks. They got a dozen of those. It's a 60-hour fermentation, which is not particularly long. It's not warm there, so they don't have the time battles. They've only got 4 stills, 2 wash stills at 18,000 liters, 2 spirit stills at 12,000 liters. Relatively short with flat lie arms. Nothing fancy about the still. It's this mixed peat and the mild peat that's sort of the claim to fame for Highland Park. But there's one other thing that Highland Park does that's fairly unique, and that is that they do not use third-party barrels. They don't use any bourbon barrels. They don't even really use sherry barrels, but they do age in sherry. But here's how they do it. Highland Distillers for many years has owned forests in both Missouri and in Spain. And so they cut their own oak for their own barrels, and then they age them with sherry. So they buy sherry for the purpose, and they soak these new make barrels in sherry for 2 years before they put their own fill in it. They fill at a fairly high level at 69.5, but that's because the wood is new, and so there's more ability to extract on that. They're not dealing with the fact that there's been previous spirit in the barrel. So they have more options on how they do that. They do very traditional storage. Concrete floors, but only 3 high horizontal racking. Because the climate is so mild there, they don't have all those same problems. It's just wooden rack houses. And then they combine their barrels into that cask combination to get to their flavor points. And a 12-year they don't do any barrel mixing per se. It's all the same kinds of barrels across the board, except for they're both sherry barrels, just some Spanish oak and some American oak. And you can buy this. The Bevmos have got them. They're about 43% alcohol, $50. So not extreme for a 12-year-old. It's kind of a bargain. You'll spend more on a 12-year-old Macallan for sure, and you're going to get a nice intro to peat. It's pretty light and sweet. It's very drinkable, and it's one of the components that goes into making famous grouse alongside the Macallan. So it's a special kind of whiskey. It won its titles for a reason, and it's not a normal pick. If you've got a friend who likes whiskey who's never tried it before, you should get it for them. Great gift.
It apparently goes very well with sweet chili crisps. So that's another thing going for it.
I like the idea of a starter peat.
This is where you start, right? This is the whiskey you start with. It's a fresh-faced, zesty whiskey.
Yeah, and again, it doesn't hit you too hard, right? But it does have some peat in it. So lots of people don't like peat. If the first whiskey you ever tasted was a Lagavulin, no wonder you're upset.
Yeah, that's very peaty. Yeah.
So, then you went over to the Space sides and you were happy, right? You were drinking Macallan, or you were drinking Appalure or something like that. And then somebody said, well, you want to move a little more, some stronger flavors? Highland Park's a good direction to go in.